leader is a warrior who wields a sacred artifact. He engages in fierce battles with demons, risking his life to protect those who cannot defend themselves. He saved cities, and people revered him as a true hero. His exploits were passed down from generation to generation, inspiring young hearts. This is exactly the story a boy once read in a book. He was completely immersed in reading, and with a big smile on his face, he learned who the real heroes were. Suddenly other boys ran up to him and snatched the book right out of his hands. Since childhood, he had dreamed of heroes like in the book. The other boys came up and snatched the book from him, mocking him. They found it strange that he was reading alone again and again about heroes. The story he loved so much was about a boy, once weak and insignificant, who found a powerful artifact and became a hero. But the boys laughed at him. They didn't believe he was capable of such a thing. In their eyes, he lacked the courage and strength to become something more. That day he stopped just dreaming. Instead of fantasies, he made a decision. He firmly decided to become an adventurer and prove that he was worthy of being a hero. Suddenly, a loud voice rang out, demanding that the book be returned to its owner immediately. Ruby stood before them, the one who had first seen something more in the boy. It was thanks to her that he had the opportunity to get closer to his dream. When he woke up, the first person he saw was Ruby. She sat by his bed, patiently waiting for him to wake up. As soon as Ratsu opened his eyes, Ruby noticed it with joy and greeted him with a loud, cheerful voice. He jumped out of bed, terrified, and, unable to contain his excitement, asked Ruby what she was doing in his room. The girl, hesitating a little, explained that she had been knocking on the door for a long time, but he had not answered, and then she had decided to climb in through the window. She began to hastily justify herself, explaining that she had been instructed to wake Ratsu. She excitedly told him to get ready quickly, because the long-awaited blessing ceremony was to take place today. And it was true. Today was to be the day of the ceremony where children, who had reached the age of 12, would receive the bound treasures from the gods. Ratsu quickly grabbed his book, but suddenly heard his mother, standing next to his sister, saying that she could not go with them. With a warm smile, her mother gave Ruby the parting words to take care of Ratsu. Even though they were the same age, Ruby promised with a serious expression that she would look after him like a real big sister. When they reached the church, the sister looked around in surprise. There were people everywhere. She was beaming with delight and mentally compared everything that was happening to a real festival. Ratsu noted with a smile out loud that at such moments Ruby seemed like a real child to him. On the way, Ruby curiously asked him if he had read his favorite book the night before. She found it hard to believe that he, who had been waiting for this day for so long, had managed to sleep through it. Ratsu nodded with a slight smile. Ruby confessed to her brother that she felt nervous because such an event only happens once in a lifetime. Ratsu wondered with concern in his voice what would happen if he got his hands on the strange sacred treasure. The thought haunted him because he had dreamed of this day for so long. Ruby, trying to calm him down, answered that such a thing happened extremely rarely and the chances were almost zero. With a cheerful glint in her voice, Ruby remarked that since the boys from the village always looked down on them, it would be great to get something really cool to surprise everyone. Ratsu stared ahead silently. He couldn't think of anything to say, but deep down he hoped for the same. Suddenly, they heard a snippet of conversation between other boys. One of them said that if he could get AC rank or higher, he could seriously count on becoming an adventurer. The other one chuckled and asked if he was planning on just running a fruit shop in the future. In response, he honestly admitted that he didn't expect to get higher than AD rank. Nearby, another group, girls this time, were also engaged in a lively conversation. They shared their opinion that it was much safer to be protected by adventurers than to become one themselves. Their voices sounded both dreamy and slightly excited about the unknown. Ratsu suddenly realized how different the participants of the coming-of-age ceremony were. Among them were not only those who dreamed of becoming adventurers, but also those who did not aspire to this path at all. Turning around, Ratsu noticed several people whose faces did not evoke any memories. They were dressed differently, and they held themselves confidently and calmly, as if they knew more than the others. Ratsu thought that they might be adventurers. The real ones, the experienced ones, the ones he had read about so often in his books. Ratsu remembered reading in his book that if an adventurer personally invites someone, that person has a chance to become an adventurer without having to take the mandatory entrance exam. This thought ignited a spark of hope in him that maybe he would get that chance too. Ruby quietly asked her brother if he remembered his promise. There was a gentle urgency in her voice, as if she expected him to remember something important. They were to protect people from demons and become the greatest heroes. That was the promise they made together. These words were not just words for them, but a goal they strove for with all their hearts. They decided to fulfill their promise by becoming adventurers. This was their way to their goal, to protect people and become heroes, like in the stories written in books. Suddenly another group of children appeared, who immediately began to noisily discuss something. They paid attention to them. One of the boys, in the heat of the moment, confidently declared to his friends that he had just seen a real hero, not just anyone, but a real, living hero. Ruby immediately remembered that hero was not just a word, but a special title given to the strongest of adventurers. At that moment, a group of girls approached them. These were Ruby's friends, who had been looking for her for a long time. They began to talk animatedly, happy that they had finally found her among the crowd. Ruby turned to her brother with a smile and said that she would just step away for a second, and Ratsu remained standing, watching her disappear among her peers. Ruby always had many friends. She easily found a common language with others and shone in any company. Ratsu was her complete opposite, shy, quiet, and most often alone. While his sister easily merged into the noisy crowd, he remained on the sidelines, feeling like a stranger among his peers. While Ratsu was lost in his thoughts, one of the children quickly passed by him and accidentally brushed his shoulder. Ratsu swayed slightly to the side, emerging from his thoughts. Ratsu turned around and saw that it was Helio. With a mocking grin, he sarcastically apologized, throwing in a taunt about not noticing such a small boy. Helio, with a fake grin, asked if Ratsu was really going to participate in the ceremony. His gaze was mocking, as if he sincerely doubted that such a quiet man was capable of anything more. As if on purpose, Helio mockingly spoke about how a weakling like Ratsu would hardly be able to obtain the artifact. He doubted that he would be able to fight at all, and with a grin, he hinted that Ratsu had considered not coming to the ceremony at all. There was a sarcastic confidence in his words. For someone like him, there was no point in even trying. Ratsu smiled awkwardly, trying to hide his embarrassment, as if he had taken it all for a clumsy joke. His answer was uncertain and vague, as if he did not know how to respond. Suddenly Helio snatched the book from his hands, looking at the cover with feigned surprise, as if he did not believe that Ratsu was still reading the same thing. With a sneer, Helio began to make caustic remarks, mocking the fact that Ratsu supposedly hoped to become a hero if he suddenly obtained a powerful artifact. His words sounded openly disdainful, as if Ratsu were nothing more than a dreamy child playing with fairy tales. Ruby was suddenly there. Quickly and confidently, she grabbed Helio's hand, not letting him make the next gesture. Her gaze became firm, and her voice sounded stern. She demanded the book back. Her determination left no doubt. Ratsu was not alone. Ratsa felt something warm spreading inside him. He was touched by how timely Ruby came to his aid. Her support allowed him to finally breathe a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, Helio only sneered contemptuously, annoyed by the girl's interference. Without another word, he threw the book back in irritation, as if it were a burden to him. Already leaving, Helio's company shouted a taunt after them, saying that Ratsu was just a coward who was being protected by a girl, and he was not worthy of owning the artifact. The words hit harder than the act itself. Ratsu turned pale, his heart began to pound, and a cold sweat appeared on his forehead. He was shocked and could hardly believe that all this was happening in reality. While Ratsu stood there with his head down, feeling humiliated and defeated, Ruby had already bent down and picked up his book. She acted calmly and confidently, as if she had not heard a single insult. Ruby stood up and handed her brother the book. Her face was lit up with a soft, encouraging smile. There was no doubt in her eyes, only a quiet confidence. As if casually, with a slight smile, she reminded him that he was going to be a cool hero. With glowing eyes, Ratsa looked at his sister. At that moment, he felt again how much she understood him. Without unnecessary words, without reproaches, just there, at the right moment, with support that warmed him more than any artifact. And then the long-awaited moment arrived. The ceremony began. People slowly entered the church with high vaulted ceilings, rising as if to the sky itself. The space was filled with soft candlelight, casting wavering shadows on the walls. In the back of the hall, behind the priest, stood a majestic statue of a woman. On her head rested a wreath, like a symbol of wisdom and power. In one hand she held a blazing flame, and in the other a heavy hammer. Those who were to undergo the ritual, one after another, made their way to the altar, holding their breath before this sacred moment. Ratsu frantically turned the pages of his book, his gaze darting from line to line. Once a year, when the bound light emanated from the sun, the hero managed to enter into a dialogue with the god. He reread the phrase over and over again, as if searching for an answer, a certainty, a sign. His heart beat faster and faster. At that moment, Ruby turned sharply and called out loudly to her brother. The ceremony was already beginning. One of their peers stepped forward and said firmly that he was ready to go first. His hands were shaking and his forehead was sweaty, but his eyes were full of confidence. He didn't hesitate, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He began to slowly approach the altar, where a statue of a woman with a wreath on her head stood, holding a flame in one hand and a hammer in the other. An old priest, standing a little to the side, carefully watched his every step, holding a book in his hands. The old priest declared that since the young man was ready, he should pray. The boy knelt down, clasped his hands together, and closed his eyes. Bright sunlight fell on him through the window, as if blessing him with its warmth. The bright sunlight blinded everyone present, causing them to involuntarily close their eyes. Ratsa looked around in confusion, not understanding what exactly was happening at that moment. As he got used to the blinding light, he suddenly realized that this was the very blessing ceremony that was spoken of in the book. A large steel axe, a C-rank artifact, appeared in the boy's hands. Everyone present froze, amazed by its power and the meaning of the gift. The boy raised the axe above his head and proclaimed his name in a powerful voice. A wave of applause and enthusiastic cries erupted in the hall. The old priest stood up and began to say that the true power of the artifact could only be revealed after it was equipped, and if someone obtained the sacred treasure, it would definitely need to be reported to everyone. Helio, with a cold, piercing gaze, carefully watched every movement in the hall, as if calculating weak points. At that moment, one of the girls suddenly stepped forward, attracting everyone's attention and ready to accept the challenge of the next participant in the ceremony. She went up to the altar and knelt down. Her artifact turned out to be a glittering storm dagger, also a rare and powerful C rank. At that moment, someone from the crowd loudly remarked that this was an excellent sign, and perhaps the land would yield a bountiful harvest this year. Everyone was stunned. The ceremony was already the second time that a C rank artifact had been received by a person. The room was filled with tense anticipation. Everyone was waiting with bated breath to see what would happen next. Ratsu thought it was no wonder that the people around him were so happy, because sacred treasures were strictly ranked, and receiving a C rank meant a great honor and responsibility. The ranks were in descending order. The strongest was A rank, then B rank, and after that came C rank. D rank was considered the middle level. And at this ceremony, 2 participants had already received C rank artifacts, which caused genuine delight and excitement among everyone. Ruby turned to her brother with a bright smile, full of hope, and said that she believed they would get good artifacts. Ratsu hesitated, but nodded in response, quietly confirming that he hoped for the same. His insides were clenching. He knew that today was the day everything had to change. He no longer wanted to be a weakling, teased and humiliated by everyone. He needed to get a strong artifact. He absolutely had to. Ratsu was visibly nervous, and his sister noticed it. She smiled softly, and said that she was sure that everything would work out well in the end. The distribution continued, and soon one of the participants received the lightning spear, a powerful B rank artifact. A buzz of admiration broke out in the hall. Everyone immediately recognized who had received the rare artifact. It was Helio. His friends and acquaintances did not look surprised, as if they had known from the very beginning that everything would be exactly like this. A crowd immediately gathered around him. Someone asked to see the new weapon. Others began to vie with each other to discuss how strong he would now be. Among those gathered around Helio were real adventurers. Having seen his artifact, they began vying with each other to invite him to join their groups. Each tried to grab the guy's attention, praising their teams and promising a brilliant future. At that moment, Helio was basking in glory. Everything was going the way he always wanted. Ratsu congratulated Helio sincerely despite everything. He knew how hard he had worked to become an adventurer. It was truly impressive. But Ruby, watching Helio's triumph, was angry. Clenching her fists, she resolutely walked towards the altar. Her eyes showed confidence that she would receive an artifact much more powerful. As she climbed the steps, she did not look back, but she still heard her brother wish her luck behind her. Ruby walked up the steps and stood before the old priest, bowing slightly in respect. She then knelt before the altar, bowing her head in prayer before the majestic statue of the goddess. The rays of light that filtered through the high windows of the church softly illuminated her figure, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The hall was silent. Everyone held their breath, waiting for what treasure would be bestowed upon her. Watching his sister sit quietly before the altar, lost in prayer, Ratsu felt a thrill well up inside. He wondered if she realized how much her support meant to him. Did she see how hard he was trying? Since childhood, Ratsu spent his time with books. While other children ran through the streets, laughed and played together, he sat in the shade of the trees with a book in his hands. Passers-by often pointed at him, laughing at the fact that he was always alone. For them, he was strange, but for Ratsu, books were the whole world, the only place where he felt strong. One day, Ratsu was sitting alone, engrossed in his book. Suddenly, a group of boys, led by Helio, surrounded him. They snatched the book from him and began laughing, mocking his dreams of becoming a hero. He felt humiliated and helpless, when Ruby suddenly appeared through the din of ridicule. She confidently stood between her brother and the bullies, blocking their path. Her determination silenced even the loudest of them. Without hesitation, Ruby confronted Helio, and soon the argument turned into a brawl, with fists being thrown. While they were shouting at each other, Ratsu sat hunched over on the ground, silently crying, clutching a crumpled book. Later, when the sun had set, they were walking home. The road was quiet. Then Ruby said that as much as she wanted to, she couldn't protect her little brother forever. With a smile on her face, she handed him the book and gently but firmly told him that he had to become strong. Her voice was not only supportive, but also filled with faith in his future. At that moment, looking at Ruby smiling, Ratsa felt a warm and solid desire blazing in his chest. He wanted to be as strong, as brave, as confident as his sister, whom he was watching right now. She stood at the altar, surrounded by bright light, her back to him, calm, focused, and determined. The light streaming from above seemed almost heavenly, and at that moment she really did remind him of the hero from his favorite books. Turning to the assembled people watching the ceremony, Ruby awkwardly looked up and quietly but clearly said that her artifact was the Fire Dragon Sword, A rank. She stood half-turned, holding the impressive blade in her hands, blazing with an internal heat. For a split second, there was a dead silence in the church. No one could believe what they were hearing. The air itself seemed to freeze before the room exploded with cheers. Applause and cries of joy filled the room. Everyone was vying with each other to explain what a magnificent artifact Ruby had obtained. Some said they had never seen anything so powerful before. The sword glowed in her hands like the flames of a living dragon, and it was impossible to take your eyes off it. It was truly magnificent. Watching his sister with a sparkle in his eyes, Ratsa couldn't help but admire her. She was a real hero, like the ones from the books he loved to read. Ruby stood at the altar with a huge sword, almost as tall as her, and waved her hand at him with a wide smile. At that moment, she seemed to be shining, like the heroine of a legend herself, who came out of the pages of a tale, strong, brave, and inimitable. All the adventurers immediately rushed to Ruby, vying with each other to invite her to join their groups. There were so many of them that she couldn't even break through to her brother. Finding herself in a dense ring of strangers, Ruby, barely catching Ratsu's eye through the crowd, smiled at him and wished him luck with a gesture. He thanked his sister for her support, clutched his book in his hands, and took a step forward. As he walked up to the altar, under the watchful gaze of those around him, Ratsu felt his heart beat faster. After introducing himself, he knelt before the statue and closed his eyes. His lips silently whispered a prayer, asking the deity to give him the strength to become a hero. He craved the power that would change him, the weak, whiny Ratsu that everyone laughed at. He wanted to become someone that even Helio couldn't humiliate or defeat. Someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with Ruby, not in the shadow of her glory, but as an equal. But most importantly, he needed strength to protect Ruby, so that no one could harm her again. The sun's rays illuminated Ratsu, and opening his eyes, he saw a weapon in front of him. He was so surprised that he could not utter a word. The weapon looked more like a sword molded from clay, and it was completely unclear what it actually was. There was a deathly silence, which was suddenly broken by the laughter of Helio and his friends. They mockingly called Ratsu's artifact a pitiful trinket and trash. Ruby ignored the taunts and hurried towards her brother, who stood amidst the laughter and ridicule. As she got closer, a stranger suddenly approached them, causing Ruby to turn around sharply. Insanely beautiful and well-groomed, the adventurer girl stood out from everyone else. Her long blonde hair flowed over her armor, which glittered in the light of the hall. She walked confidently through the crowd, as if no one around could hinder her path. Everyone present watched her with their mouths open, not believing their eyes. No one expected to see such a figure in this place. Some recognized the guest and looked at her with a mixture of horror and awe. There could be no mistake, she was the very legend whose arrival changed the course of events. It was the heroine Polluti. Stopping in front of the brother and sister, she looked at them carefully and invited one of them to join her. The appeal was addressed to Ruby Blood. Everyone present was amazed by what was happening and had no doubt that she would accept the hero's invitation. Ruby, however, suddenly felt a cold sweat, not expecting such a turn of events. Polluti, confident of a positive answer, slowly turned and began to leave, for the invitation was a generous and honorable gift. But at that moment Ruby faltered, the words caught in her throat, and she could not immediately answer. Ruby grabbed her brother's hand and pulled Ratsu along with her, hurrying towards the exit and begging Polluti to wait. Ratsu was taken aback by his sister's outburst, but managed to tighten his grip on his weapon, preparing for the unknown. His weapon was a rusty sword of the lowest rank, a pitiful and devalued weapon. With horror and disbelief in his eyes, Ratsu stared at this lifeless piece of iron, as if the world around him had collapsed. But there was no time to think. He and Ruby hurried to catch up with the hero. She turned sharply, and their eyes met for a moment, filled with tension and an inescapable challenge. Ruby was insistently asking for Rats to join their group. Polluti glanced at the pathetic, rusty sword that hung awkwardly from Ruby's brother's hands. Turning fully towards the company, Polluti coldly told Rats that with such a weapon, he would never become a real adventurer. Ratsu stood with his head down, feeling his insides constrict with emptiness and bitterness. His heart was beating hard, and Polluti's words had cut off the last drops of hope, leaving him completely empty and powerless against everything that was happening. He did not doubt every word. It was a sentence. His artifact was the weakest of all, and he understood that with such a pitiful weapon, it was impossible to inflict even a scratch on the demons whose hard skin was bound by magic. Polluti mercilessly explained that only high-ranking artifacts were capable of penetrating their defense, and that Ratsu with his pitiful sword was simply doomed to defeat. Ratsu was sure that the blessing ceremony had failed completely for him, and that he would forever remain a loser. The hero looked closely at his weapon, and asked if it was really the lowest possible rank. Without waiting for an answer, she explained that if Ratsu went with them, he would quickly become prey to demons and monsters. Turning away and continuing on her way, she tossed over her shoulder that it would be better for him to surrender for his own safety. Meanwhile, his sister remained optimistic and firmly believed that the truth could not be known unless one tried. She constantly begged Polluti to take her brother with him, promising to support and help Rats at every step. Ratsu froze, not believing his ears. What did it mean to help him? He felt everything inside him turn over. Was his sister really ready to put him above a real hero? Was she really going to protect him always, no matter what? This thought made Ratsu protest internally. He hated being dependent on others. But looking at Ruby, who was beaming with a warm smile, he felt that this care. He made his decision on the very day his book was taken away from him, and he sat there in tears while his sister made the decision for him and consoled him. From then on he no longer wanted anyone to protect him. He wanted to be strong and independent. Standing with his head down, he shrank into himself and through clenched teeth said for her to go ahead and wait for him there. Ruby froze, stunned and confused. It seemed to her that she did not understand at all what was happening inside her brother. Ratsu firmly stated that he was going to take the test on his own and become a true adventurer. Ruby, surprised and excited, asked him what he meant and what about their shared promise to protect people and become heroes together. Ratsu replied with determination in his voice that he would become an adventurer who never lost to heroes, and that he would prove it to everyone one day. Tears glistened in his eyes, but a confident smile played on his face. He firmly believed that he would become a man capable of protecting his sister. Clenching his fists, he told Ruby that he would definitely catch up with her and be there for her. Ruby remembered how, as a child, her brother, although very small, would shout loudly at toothy crocodiles, little monsters, to get away from her. Despite his age, he was brave and protected her from danger. He held her hand tightly, leading her forward as she cried silently. In his other hand he only had a stick, but he kept comforting his sister, assuring her that she was strong and all the monsters were gone and couldn't hurt them anymore. Despite the trembling in his body and tears, he gathered all his will into a fist, turned to his sister with a determined smile, and confidently told her not to cry anymore. At that moment, the true meaning of the word hero lit up in Ruby's heart. With a slight smile, she remembered those moments when her brother showed strength and courage, and understood that true courage is not always about victories, but about the willingness to move forward no matter what. She hugged her brother and quietly whispered in his ear that great trials and amazing feats awaited them ahead. She would wait for him. All that was left for Rats to do was to catch up with her. This became their new, unshakable promise. Ruby left with the hero, and Ratsa clenched his fists, watching the carriage as it moved away. Ratsa felt strongly that he had failed to keep his promise to become an adventurer with Ruby. It was at this moment that he made a new, even more decisive promise. He got the weakest artifact, a rusty sword, which Ratsu involuntarily compared to himself. But this did not mean that he was going to give up. He firmly believed that one day he would definitely become an adventurer. No, he would become a real hero. Ruby, sitting next to her brother, thought about how different he was from the hero of the book she loved to read. Unlike the brave and determined character, her brother, in her opinion, was weak, often cried, and did not inspire confidence. Ratsa didn't even have an artifact, but despite this, he already became a real hero for Ruby. A low roar came from the trees, and a shadow rushed through the bushes, closing in instantly. The creature rushed towards her with fury. Ruby trained hard to gain confidence in the use of her artifact. She practiced her strikes, moves, and techniques, and learned to fight alongside the other members of her group. However, the monster turned out to be quite small, more timid than dangerous. Screaming and panicking in such a situation was unnecessary. Some of the group members looked at each other with displeasure when they heard Ruby make a noise. Paluti calmly explained to Ruby that there were no strong or dangerous monsters in the forest near the village. The area was considered relatively safe, and everyone involved in the training knew this. Therefore, her fear was perceived as an overreaction caused by insecurity and lack of experience. So, moving closer to Ruby, Paluti gently but firmly lowered her weapon. Her gesture was calm, there was no anger or reproach in it. She reminded Ruby that the real threat did not come from such creatures, and that they should be prepared for much greater challenges. These monsters were not something to be afraid of. Ruby, as if waking from a deep sleep, finally realized the situation she was in. Taking a step forward, she sincerely apologized to the hero for her thoughtless reaction. She decided to share with the others that she used to come to this forest often to play with the other children of the village. In those days, the trees seemed taller, the sun shone brighter, and every corner of the forest was full of magic and adventure. It was an old, almost forgotten story from her childhood, but the memory of it awakened a warm feeling of nostalgia in Ruby. Paluti, watching Ruby closely, decided to ask her a question that had been hanging in the air for a long time. She gently asked if she was worried about her brother Ratsu. Ruby turned to the hero, holding his gaze, and replied that it was a little different. One of the adventurers in their group asked Ruby a question in surprise. Even though there were no strong monsters in this forest, how could children play here at all? Ruby, smiling slightly, replied that she was always protected back then. These words immediately aroused the curiosity of the others, and soon several voices almost simultaneously asked who it was that protected her as a child. With a small smile on her face, Ruby looked at her companions and said that she was protected by a hero. Her voice sounded warm, almost tender, as if she was transported back to those distant days when she felt completely safe. At this time, at home, Ruby and Ratsu's mother was slowly sweeping at the very entrance. A warm breeze raised light dust, and the sun gently illuminated her tired but kind face. Suddenly, she noticed her son appear nearby. Surprised by his unexpected appearance, she stopped, leaned on a broom, and asked what he was doing there. Her voice sounded genuine concern, mixed with slight excitement. He had been standing in front of his mother since early morning, ready to start work on the farm. His high boots hugged his legs, perfect for digging in the soil, and his hat protected his head from the sun. In one hand, he held a tool for tending the garden beds. Everything that was happening seemed quite normal to him, since from early childhood he had been surrounded only by women, and such duties were familiar to him. He was about to go to work, when suddenly he heard his mother's voice calling him with a note of surprise. She walked towards him, holding his artifact in her hands, and told him that he had forgotten to take it. Her voice was filled with the usual soft reproach, mixed with motherly concern. She held out the artifact as if she were handing him something more than just a thing, as if reminding her son of his path and purpose. She looked at him kindly and reminded him that he had been planning to become an adventurer. Her words were a quiet reminder of the choice he had already made. She added that he no longer had time to farm, for there were trials, adventures, and the path he had charted for himself ahead. There was no reproach in her eyes, only the concern and tenderness of a mother releasing her son into a world where he would have to cope without her support. In response, she asked him for only one thing. If the situation became truly dangerous, he should not hesitate to flee and save his life. Her voice was soft, but there was a firm determination in it. As he walked into the forest with the rusty sword that was his artifact, Ratsu clearly realized how much he owed to his mother and sister. Their support and care became a real pillar of strength for him in the most difficult moments. The determination to one day repay them for everything they had done for him grew stronger in his heart. He noticed a fresh track on the road from the adventurer's carriage. These clear marks on the ground caught his attention and aroused his curiosity. The track seemed recent, as if someone had just passed along this path. It reminded him of those who had set out on the journey before him, and made him want to keep up and move forward with them. He had decided to become an adventurer, no matter how far Ruby would go. His choice was firm and unwavering. For him, it was not just a desire, but a calling that required his full dedication. While thinking about how something important had happened to him and Ruby a long time ago in this very forest, Ratsu suddenly heard a strange sound. He stopped, straining his ears, listening to the quiet rustling and barely perceptible movements in the bushes. A living tree creature suddenly appeared behind him. It made a nasty, creaking sound, and its branches whipped around, as if trying to catch something invisible. This creature appeared right behind Ratsu. This made him jump sharply and immediately become wary. In the silence of the forest, this creaking sound sounded especially ominous and threatening. It was a treant, a living tree, and Ratsu did not even notice how it had crept up on him unnoticed, ready to strike. He managed to jump out of the way of the blow, simultaneously performing a rapid somersault to the side. The branches of the treant flew past, almost touching him, but he deftly dodged at the last moment. His heart was beating hard, and his breathing became intermittent. He was already ready for his next move and determined not to be caught. Ratsu grabbed the treant's branch and tried to strike with his artifact. However, the sword was dull and rusty, so it could not cut through the strong wood. Despite all his efforts, the blow was in vain, and the treant remained unharmed, continuing to threaten him with its branches. He instantly realized that his blow had been useless and had done no harm. The next moment, a powerful blow from a treant branch sent him flying backwards. The air whistled in his ears, and his body landed hard on the ground. Ratsu felt a sharp pain, but his eyes burned with a bright fire of determination. He was not going to give up, despite the blows of fate and the difficulties that he encountered along the way. At that moment, the unwavering spirit of a warrior ignited inside him, ready to fight to the end for his goal. He stood up again, full of determination, and clutched his artifact tightly in his hand. He remembered his promise to Ruby, to catch up with her and not to retreat at any cost. This thought gave him strength and did not allow him to lower his head even in the most difficult moments. He quickly stood up and took a fighting stance right in front of the treant, ready to fight again. The fire of determination burned in his eyes. However, he returned home all wounded, covered in bruises and bumps. His mother, noticing his condition, anxiously asked if he had escaped from the test. Ratsu nodded sadly and admitted that he had. His voice sounded with a hint of disappointment. The next day, Ratsu went into the forest again, ready for another battle. He knew that every step brought him closer to his dream of becoming a true adventurer, and so, without wasting any time, he once again entered into battle with the treant. This time he moved with more confidence, carefully watching his opponent's every move. The mistakes of the past helped him understand the importance of keeping a cool head and using not only strength but also intelligence. However, when Ratsu attacked the treant again with his artifact, he encountered the same problem. His sword was as dull as a stick and could not even scratch the enemy's strong tree branches. Each of his blows only bounced off the monster's body, causing no harm. The next day after this, Ratsu went out into the forest again to fight the treant. Passers-by villagers, seeing his lonely struggle, stopped and wondered what exactly he was doing there. And so the next day after that he again entered into battle with the treant, and so it continued day after day. Each fight became a test for him, an opportunity to become stronger and learn something new. Despite fatigue and failures, he did not give up, repeating these fights again and again, as if tempering himself in the fire of struggle. Thus passed 3 years of full hard training, battles, and incessant striving towards his goal. The girls stood on the bridge and animatedly discussed why they should not leave the village. They dreamed of change, of a new life far from their usual places, but their conversation was full of doubts and uncertainty. None of them knew where to find work in another city or village, and this uncertainty constrained their plans. They were hesitant and wondered if the capital wasn't full of jobs. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound in the bushes that the girls didn't notice at first. The next moment, a treant burst out from behind the trees and let out a loud, piercing scream as soon as it was close enough. Its terrible sound cut through the silence, causing the girls to flinch. There were several monsters, and they were slowly approaching the girls. At the most unexpected moment, Ratsu suddenly appeared from behind their backs. He quickly jumped forward and immediately rushed into battle with the treant. Striking one blow after another with his sword, he fought bravely, not giving the treant a second to rest. Each swing of the weapon was filled with determination and strength, and his movements became more confident and precise. Ratsu turned to the girls and informed them that the treant had been approaching the village entrance, but that the danger was now over. He assured them that everything was fine and none of them were hurt. Suddenly, an arrow flew past his face and accurately hit the second monster, which was sneaking up on Rats from behind. The girls giggled happily, admitting how easy it was for them to defeat the monster with one blow. They thanked Ratsu for his help with a slight smile and sarcasm, hinting at how easily they dealt with the monster. Standing in the clearing, Ratsu thought about how 3 years had passed since his sister Ruby left the village. He wondered how close he was to his goal of catching up with her and becoming as strong as she was. In his mind, he weighed the path he had traveled, his successes and failures, trying to figure out if he had grown enough in this time to be able to face her one day. The only result of 3 years of training was only the 10th level, and Ratsu resigned himself to the thought that he did not have real talent after all. He felt bitter disappointment, but deep down he knew that not everyone is born a great hero. Despite this, somewhere inside there remained a spark of hope that perseverance and hard work could one day change his fate. Ratsu realized that he had to work harder, because at this rate he would not be able to catch up with his sister. At that moment, someone noticed him from behind and quietly told their interlocutor that Ratsu had come here again. Turning around, Ratsu saw 2 brothers who had come into the forest to collect firewood. Their eyes met for a moment, and he felt that he was being watched. Suddenly, one of the brothers, not hiding the mockery in his voice, turned to Ratsu. He said that he had been training tirelessly for 3 years, but hadn't he realized yet that it was all useless? His words hung in the air like a challenge, causing Ratsu to freeze for a moment. At that moment, Ratsu remembered his sister Ruby, who had once told him that she would wait. Those words resounded in his memory again, filling his heart with warmth and determination. He wondered how far Ruby must have come in all this time. Perhaps she had already reached the heights he could only dream of. The thought weighed heavily on his heart, and for a moment he felt as if he would never be able to catch up with her. A deafening cry rang out in the forest, piercing the silence and causing the birds to fly from the branches. Ratsu instantly jumped up, his heart began to beat faster, and without a second's hesitation, he rushed in the direction from which the child's voice came. His steps were quick and determined. He immediately assumed that a child was most likely lost in the forest. The thought of this did not give him peace, so without wasting a second, he headed deeper into the thicket, listening carefully to every sound. His heart beat faster, he walked faster, as if he felt that he had to hurry. At some point, a faint silhouette flashed between the trees. He came closer and finally noticed the child, who was standing alone in the middle of a small forest clearing. His sister Ruby stood before him, and he recognized her immediately, though something seemed odd. She looked much younger than she actually was, as if time had turned back. Her eyes were full of fear, her hands were shaking, and her gaze was fixed forward. Ratsu suddenly realized that a scene from the past was playing out before him. He remembered how, as a child, his sister Ruby had gotten lost in this very forest. Everything had looked exactly the same clearing, the same trees, the same uneasy silence. Then she had almost been attacked by strange creatures that had emerged from the shadows. They had been frightening and seemed to be a product of the forest itself. Now everything was repeating itself, as if the past was coming to life right before his eyes. He froze, unsure whether to intervene. His thoughts were racing, his heart was pounding, and his body seemed frozen. He hesitated, unsure whether he had the right to change what had already happened. At that moment, he saw something unexpected. A boy ran out from the depths of the forest, his eyes furious. It was himself, only small, like he had been as a child. The child rushed into battle with a scream, without thinking, without fear, driven only by the determination to protect his sister. He swung his arms wildly, charging forward with a determination that would make even the bravest retreat. The monsters surrounding Ruby stopped. Their movements slowed, their gazes frozen. It was as if they didn't understand what was happening. Little Ratsu screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing through the forest. He ran up to Ruby, grabbed her hand tightly, and pulled her along. Without looking back, he ran, leading his sister through the thicket, where every branch seemed like an obstacle. The monster still stood there, stunned by his boldness and suddenness. The real Ratsu stood there, stunned, unable to look away from what was happening. His heart was pounding, and his thoughts were tangled into a tangle of questions. There he was, a little boy, not like he had been in a long time. The boy, holding the hand of the frightened Ruby, led her to a safe place, away from the clearing and those frightening creatures. When they finally stopped among the thick trees, he began to speak to her in a quiet, soothing voice. His words were full of care and confidence. Little Ratsu, despite his age, suddenly looked surprisingly mature, and the real Ratsu felt how this awakened forgotten feelings in him. Suddenly, the real Ratsu felt a clear realization flash through him. He watched as the younger him consoled his sister. And then his gaze fell on something that had escaped his attention until then. In the boy's hand was an ordinary stick, a very simple one, like a branch accidentally picked up from the ground. But it was this stick that played a decisive role that day. His sister knew from childhood that he dreamed of becoming a real hero. She believed in him, even when he doubted himself. Suddenly, his sister appeared in front of the real Ratsu. She was as small as the day it all happened. Her eyes looked at him with warmth. Her voice was quiet but confident. She came closer, raised her head, and said that she would wait for the day when he would truly become a real hero. Ratsu sat with his back against the tree trunk. His breathing was even, and a shadow of the emotions he had experienced remained on his face. His eyes slowly opened, their gaze still clouded. He looked around, listened to the silence of the forest, and felt reality gradually returning. Everything he had just experienced had turned out to be a dream. A surge of motivation washed over him like a wave, returning strength and clarity. He stood up abruptly, gripping his artifact tighter in his hand, a rusty sword that seemed useless to others, but to him held special meaning. Suddenly, a piercing scream came from the depths of the forest. Ratsu froze, his heart beating faster. He looked around, doubt gripping him. Maybe he hadn't woken up? Maybe this was all still a dream? Quickly realizing that this was not a dream, Ratsu stood up abruptly and rushed forward without wasting a second. He raced through the undergrowth, feeling how each step brought him closer to the source of the scream. When he ran into a clearing, he immediately noticed a little girl standing in the middle of the tall grass. Ratsu barely had time to exhale before his eyes fell on a movement in the shadows of the trees. A huge monster slowly emerged from the forest. It looked like a wolf, but it stood on two legs like a man. Its fur was bristling, its mouth was slightly open, and its sharp fangs gleamed in the light through the leaves. It bared its teeth, not taking its eyes off the child, and there was a threat in its eyes. Ratsu froze, unable to believe what he saw. This was not just a beast, it was a demon, darkness incarnate in the form of a wolf. He did not know how to defeat such a creature, and fear gripped him from within. Demons, unlike ordinary monsters, were intelligent and cunning. They could plan, sense the fear of their victims, and exploit the weaknesses of their enemies. While humans received treasures from the gods, demons received their artifacts from the dark forces, evil deities whose will fueled their rage and destruction. These treasures were dangerous, granting their owners superhuman strength and making them nearly invulnerable. Overcome with horror at what was happening, Ratsu tried to keep his thoughts clear. He recalled everything he knew about demons. These creatures were enemies of humanity, related to darkness and endowed with intelligence, which made them especially dangerous. Hearing a surprised cry behind him, Ratsu turned around abruptly. At the edge of the clearing stood two boys, brothers he knew who often came to the forest for firewood. One of them was holding an armful of branches, the other stood frozen with his mouth open, looking straight at the demon. They immediately, without thinking, rushed to run away from the clearing. Ratsu rushed after them, caught up with one of the brothers, and grabbed him by the shoulder, trying to understand what was happening. He turned around. His face was pale, his eyes wide open with fear. He only managed to exhale that they must get out of here immediately. Ratsu was completely confused. Were they really just going to run away, leaving the little girl alone in the middle of the clearing where the demon was hiding? He couldn't believe that the brothers were so willing to abandon a defenseless child. His voice shook with indignation as he demanded an explanation. But in response, he heard that the most important thing now was to call the village guards. One of the brothers, still trembling with fear, turned to Rats and spoke quickly. He explained that just as a man who defeats a demon receives a blessing from the gods, so a demon who kills a man becomes stronger. Every death a demon causes feeds its power, makes it more dangerous, and brings it closer to new dark gifts. The brother spoke quickly, almost on the verge of panic. He was sure that the demon would leave no one alive. Ratsu, still seething with indignation, grabbed one of the brothers by the lapels and pressed him to himself. His voice trembled with rage as he began to speak, almost shouting. He demanded an explanation, tried to reach the boy's mind. While they ran after the guards, the girl would be left alone, and the demon would kill her if no one stood up to protect her. Ratsu claimed that he had an artifact, and therefore he was obliged to fight, even if the chance of victory was negligible. But his brother, pushing him away, sharply replied that his artifact was not suitable for fighting a demon. As he was running away, the older brother shouted over his shoulder that the artifact was not meant for combat, and that he had no chance with it. The younger brother, running alongside, added that if they did not inform the guards right now, the entire village would be in danger. Ratsu stood there, watching them go. He felt loneliness enveloping him once more, but with it a firm determination was born in his heart. Ratsu tightened his grip on the hilt of his rusty sword, raised his head, and turned towards the clearing. A few steps away from the frightened girl, the demon was already standing. He approached slowly, with predatory confidence, preparing to strike. Ratsu took a step forward, feeling his heart thunder in his chest, but fear no longer ruled him. The little girl had tears in her eyes. She stood there, shaking with fear, barely holding back her sobs. Quietly, almost soundlessly, she cried, clenching her fists and trying not to look at the approaching demon. The demon, already raising his clawed hand to strike, suddenly paused for a moment and spoke out loud. His voice was hoarse, drenched in contempt and icy calm. He seemed to be reasoning with himself, lazily, as if deciding something insignificant. Bowing his head, he muttered that the enhancement from such a small girl would be insignificant. Too weak, too young, almost no use. Ratsu stood directly behind the demon, his voice firm and unwavering. He ordered him to step away from the child. The demon froze abruptly, not expecting to hear someone behind him. His shoulders tensed, and his clawed fingers froze in midair. A tense silence hung in the forest. The demon slowly began to turn around, turning his huge body towards the new person who dared to interfere. His eyes narrowed, a mocking grin appeared on his lips, but there was caution in his movements. He did not expect resistance. Ratsu, without moving from his place, spoke again firmly and loudly, so that each word sounded like an order, "Move away from the child." The demon smirked and turned to Rats mockingly. He said that he was speaking too quietly and that he had not heard his order. The demon's voice was mocking and cold, as if he enjoyed fear and disrespect. His eyes sparkled with malice, and every word was filled with a contemptuous confidence in his own strength. Ratsu would not tolerate the demon's words or gaze any longer. He gripped the hilt of his rusty sword, took a deep breath, and, gathering all his resolve, rushed forward. His cry cut through the forest air, powerful and furious. Like a clap of thunder, his demand sounded, "Stay away from the child." Fear disappeared, only courage remained in his chest. Ratsu, running close, raised his rusty sword and swung it with all his might, aiming straight at the demon's head. His movements were swift, full of determination and fury. But the demon intercepted the sword with frightening ease, stopping it in midair with just one hand. The blade scraped against his claws as if it had struck stone. He slowly turned his head to Ratsu, squinting and examining the weapon, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Ratsu gritted his teeth and held the sword with both hands with all his might, preventing the demon from snatching it away completely. Despite his efforts, his fingers trembled from the strain, but he didn't let go. The demon frowned. Confusion flashed in his eyes as he realized that this was not a piece of rusty metal at all, but a genuine artifact. Suddenly the demon loosened his grip and let go of the sword. Ratsu, who had not expected such a turn of events, lost his balance and staggered forward, barely keeping his feet. The demon burst into loud, hollow laughter which shook the leaves on the trees. His laughter was full of mockery, as if he enjoyed how pathetic his opponent seemed to him with his artifact that looked like trash. Suddenly, the demon's laughter cut off as if it had been cut off by a knife. The smile disappeared from his face, replaced by a cold focus. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, no longer playing. His voice sounded dull and confident. Now, he would see what a real artifact was, and what it was capable of. Ominous lights began to break through from the darkness under his skin, and an object radiating dark power appeared in his hand. The wind in the forest seemed to die down, time stood still. The real battle was about to begin, and Rats was about to face a force he had never come close to before. Standing in the midst of the raging chaos he had caused, the demon slowly raised his hand with the artifact surrounded by dark energy. Flaming flashes destroyed everything around him. The air trembled with tension. The trees twisted under the pressure of the force. He looked at Ratsu with grim satisfaction and said, "This is true power. This is the power of the sword." The little girl, terrified to the core, was crying her eyes out. She curled up into a tight ball, hugging her knees to her chest and covering her head with her hands, as if that could save her from the approaching horror. Her sobs tore through the silence between the bursts of magical rage. Ratsu, watching this, felt his heart squeeze. He asked himself a painful question. Was this really a demon? A being with such colossal power that everything around it seemed powerless. His fingers trembled, but his thoughts were clear. Was his sister Ruby fighting the same monsters? Was she facing this again and again, alone? The thought pierced him more than any blow. Ratsu clearly realized that he was no match for the demon. The difference in strength was terrifying, and he felt it with his whole body. However, determination burned inside him. He had to win at least a few precious minutes until the guards arrived. His thoughts were focused on how to hold off the monster, even for a moment. But suddenly, everything inside him broke. He felt movement behind him, and a chill ran down his spine. The demon appeared silently right behind him. The demon was no longer going to play. He raised his artifact, and a dense wave of dark energy immediately began to emanate from it. The air around him thickened. The very ground beneath his feet began to tremble. He began to concentrate his power, gathering destructive power in his sword. His posture became threatening. He leaned forward, preparing to strike. His entire body radiated a thirst for destruction. He was going to kill Ratsu here and now, without hesitation or mercy. Ratsu, gathering the last of his strength and will, raised his rusty sword and swung it at the demon with all his might. His movement was clumsy, but determination burned in it. The blow was unexpectedly powerful, and Ratsu flew back from his own effort, barely able to keep his balance. Ratsu flew back and crashed to the ground with a thud. His body hit the hard ground with such force that a thick cloud of dust rose into the air. He groaned in pain, every movement causing a sharp pulsation. A sharp pain shot through his shoulder, and his breathing became ragged. The demon knew that he would not receive any special blessing from this opponent, and this disappointed him somewhat. However, there was still a reason within him to continue the fight. The demon caught the scent of humans coming from the surrounding lands. The scent told him that there was a village nearby, full of life and weakness. A sinister plan was born in his dark mind, to go there and cause chaos. He dreamed of how by killing all the inhabitants he could gain powerful blessings that would increase his strength. This thought fueled his greed and thirst for destruction, making his heart beat faster in anticipation of the bloody hunt to come. At that moment, Ratsa felt the danger more than ever before. He knew that the demon's main goal now was to get rid of him and the little girl, so that nothing could stop it from moving on to the next step. This realization gave him adrenaline and determination, made his heart beat faster. He knew that it wasn't just his life that was at stake now, but the fate of those who depended on him. The demon slowly approached the child, his steps confident and heavy, as if the very earth was shaking beneath him. The little girl cowered in fear, unable to even scream. In that tense moment, when it seemed there would be no salvation, Ratsa gathered his last strength and let out a deafening battle cry. His voice cut through the air, filling the space with determination and fury. Clutching the artifact in his hand, Ratsa rose from the ground and, overcoming the pain, rushed forward. His body acted faster than his thoughts, driven by only one goal: to protect the child. He rushed straight at the demon, not thinking about the consequences, not feeling fear. In his movement was all the determination accumulated over years of dreaming of becoming a hero. When the demon raised his sword to strike the child, Ratsu managed to step between him and the victim at the last moment. There was no time to think. He raised his rusty sword and with effort intercepted the demon's blow, directing it to the side. The blades collided with a deafening sound, the air trembled, and the wave of force from the collision flew in all directions, knocking leaves off the trees. When their swords crossed again, the metal rang with tension, sparks flew in all directions. The demon's blade pressed down with monstrous force, but Ratsu stood, gritting his teeth and holding the artifact with both hands. Their faces were only a few steps apart, their breaths mixing in the cold air. The demon grinned, a dark admiration flickering in his eyes. He said that Ratsu's blow was unexpectedly good, even worthy of respect. But then he added that it changed nothing. The strength between them was too different, and everything was already predetermined. The demon said with a slight mockery in his voice that they would definitely meet again. His words sounded like a dark promise, filled with confidence in his victory. Ratsa could hardly hold the sword, his muscles were burning, and his breathing was getting ragged with each passing moment. It seemed that a little more, and everything would break out of control. But he did not allow himself to fall. Despite all his efforts, Ratsa felt himself losing control. His arms ached from the strain, his breathing became ragged, but he continued to hold the blow, not allowing the demon to advance a single step. However, even his determination could not compensate for the weakness of the artifact. The rusty sword trembled, the metal creaked, and in the next moment, small fragments began to fall from the blade. Cracks appeared along the entire length. The light inside the artifact was fading. Ratsu watched in horror as his only weapon fell apart in his hands. Under the onslaught of demonic power, the sword crumbled, leaving only a fragment in his trembling palms. The demon, taking advantage of the moment when the sword crumbled, kicked Ratsu in the chest with all his might. The blow was devastating. Ratsu did not even have time to cover himself. His body was thrown into the air. He flew several meters and fell, hitting the ground head first. A dull thud echoed across the clearing, the ground shook, and a cloud of dust rose into the air. Ratsu lay face up, barely breathing, his chest heaving as his mind slowly sank into a fog of pain. His ears were ringing and blurry images flashed before his eyes. He felt his strength draining away, and everything around him was becoming more distant and dull. The demon, confident in his victory, turned to the child. His voice was emotionless, like a sentence, and he resolutely walked towards the girl, intending to get rid of her first. Ratsu, hearing the retreating footsteps, understood that he had only one last try left. Lying on the cold ground, Ratsu barely kept his consciousness. His thoughts flowed slowly, as if through thick water. With bitterness in his heart, he mentally asked Ruby for forgiveness. He couldn't keep his promise, again. He'd failed her. He'd failed the little girl. He'd failed himself. It hurt worse than the wounds. Lying on the cold ground, he silently hoped that his sister didn't hold a grudge, that she'd understand. That she'd forgive him for his weakness, for his unfulfilled words, for not being able to be who he was meant to be. But Ratsu was the only one who could protect this child right now. No one else would stand between the demon and the girl. Despite the pain, despite the fear, he knew that he had no right to give up. Gritting his teeth and leaning on the fragment of his artifact, he began to slowly rise. Ratsu stood, barely able to stand, clutching the remains of his artifact in his hands. His breathing was ragged. Every movement was difficult. The demon, who had almost reached the child, suddenly stopped. He turned over his shoulder and looked in surprise at his opponent, who, despite everything, had risen again. Despite his wounds, despite his fear, Ratsu stood. He did not retreat. He was full of confidence. Even if he was destined to die now, he would not retreat. He had to defeat the demon. He had to save the child, otherwise everything would be in vain. They looked into each other's eyes, and in the next instant, both of them rushed forward, throwing themselves into battle with fury and determination. Their swords clashed with a roar, the blow echoing across the clearing. The metal shook with tension, the ground shook beneath their feet. Ratsu gritted his teeth, putting the last of his strength into each movement. The demon strained, feeling that this fight would no longer be so easy. Ratsu's artifact began to crumble again, but for a completely different reason. Ratsu stared at his opponent, not looking away for a second, his eyes burning with determination, and every breath filled with tension. The demon was shocked. He watched in bewilderment, unable to understand why the weapon he thought useless was suddenly awakening. Before him stood no longer a broken man. Before him stood the one whose will had awakened the power of the artifact. Ratsu stood before him with a weapon that was an exact duplicate of the demonic blade. His rusty sword had disappeared, giving way to a new one. It was a cursed magic sword of the highest rank. It emanated incredible power that could not be confused with anything else. The demon was perplexed by what had happened. He looked at Ratsu, and could not understand how the one who had been lying in the dust a second ago was now standing before him with a sword equal in strength to his own. Had the artifact changed? Or perhaps his opponent had changed? Ratsu no longer seemed broken. His posture was firm, his gaze pierced the space. There was not a drop of doubt left in him. Only concentration, rage, and inner strength, which now seemed to burst out. His artifact shone with a dark light, as if awakened from a long sleep. Could this be the true form of his partner? The power hidden in the rusty sword finally manifested itself, overflowing Ratsu to the brim. But the demon was not going to give up. He roared and rushed into battle again, clutching his sword with redoubled fury. Their swords clashed with a roar, sparks flying and filling the air with the vibration of fury and power. The demon stared at Ratsu and said with irritation that he didn't like his eyes. Ratsu's gaze was cold and piercing. There was no fear or doubt in it. Only icy determination and a silent promise to see the fight through to the end. As the demon swung at Ratsu, he began to panic. His movements became abrupt and hesitant. He screamed out his fear, demanding that Ratsu speak if he had anything to say, rather than stare at him with that creepy, cold gaze. Suddenly the demon realized that he had missed. Where Ratsu had stood just a moment before, there was no one there. The void before him echoed with defeat. Ratsu had not disappeared. He had simply acted faster than the demon could comprehend. And in that moment it dawned on the demon. Everything that needed to be said, Ratsu had already said at the very beginning. Ratsu moved quickly behind the demon. His sword blade gleamed brightly in the dim light of the forest. He delivered a powerful blow, breaking through his opponent's defense. The demon flinched from the force of the blow, and sparks and dust flew around them. Ratsu firmly ordered the demon to stay away from the child. His voice was sharp and decisive, leaving no room for doubt. His eyes burned with an unwavering will to protect the innocent. Ratsu didn't understand what exactly had happened. His heart was beating wildly, and his hands were shaking from the strain. The power emanating from the artifact filled every cell of his body. The sword, which had recently been rusty and almost useless, now shimmered with a dark glow, as if taking on a new form. Rats didn't want to lose. He gritted his teeth and gripped the hilt of his sword tighter. They stood facing each other in the middle of the clearing, tension in the air. The dust raised by the last blows was slowly settling around them. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of breathing. Both were waiting to see who would be the first to break the balance, who would make the decisive move. The ground beneath their feet bore traces of the fight, but everything was frozen in anticipation of a new explosion of force. The demon roared, his voice echoing through the forest, shaking the leaves. He snarled that his opponent had only angered him with his insolent behavior, and the wound he had inflicted was just a scratch that would not harm him. His eyes blazed with rage, and he dug his claws into the ground, preparing for another attack. The demon rushed towards Ratsu with a ferocious roar, closing in on him quickly. He raised his weapon and prepared to deliver a crushing blow with a powerful swing, pouring out all the rage and determination he had accumulated in the fight. He roared in rage and began to rain blow after blow down on Ratsu with uncontrollable force. Each blow was full of fury and destructive power. The air whistled with the speed of his attacks, and the ground shook under their weight. Suddenly Ratsu, deftly dodging another blow, darted forward with lightning speed and struck with a swift blow. His sword flew through the air, leaving behind a flash of light, and pierced the demon's vulnerable spot. The blow was critical. The demon winced, his eyes widening in pain and surprise. The blow was critical. The demon winced, his eyes widening in pain and surprise. A piercing scream burst from his throat, echoing across the clearing, shaking the trees and frightening the birds in the crowns. He began to release some dark energy. The air around him began to tremble, darken, as if the shadow itself had thickened. Ratsu, catching it out of the corner of his eye, immediately understood that the demon was about to use his last, desperate spell. It was magic, black flame. Ratsu froze, overcome with shock. Ratsu put everything he had into the final blow. A powerful, wide swing of his sword cut through the flames and tore through the demon's defense. The blade flew through the air like a whirlwind and pierced the enemy with deafening force. Ratsu stood, barely able to stand. His body was covered in abrasions, his clothes were torn, and his face was smeared with dirt and blood. He was breathing heavily, but he did not lower his sword. In the last seconds of his life, the demon could barely look up at Ratsu. His mind refused to accept defeat. How could such a pathetic, filthy artifact defeat him, a warrior blessed by darkness. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His body began to disintegrate in the air, dissolving into black smoke in space. In the end, all that was left of the demon was a shadow and an ominous echo. His weapon, a grim blade, stood stuck in the ground in the middle of the empty clearing. Silence reigned in the forest once more, broken only by Ratsu's heavy breathing. Ratsu stood there, unsteady, not believing what had happened. He breathed heavily, feeling every movement send pain through his body. Images of the battle still flickered before his eyes, but the demon was gone. He had truly won. Ratsu's vision darkened, and he collapsed right where he stood. The little girl he had fought for ran to him, calling and shaking him by the shoulders, but he could no longer hear her frightened voice. Nor did he hear the footsteps of the village guards, who arrived just a few minutes later. Ratsu woke up in a bright room, unusually calm. He was lying on a clean bed, and all around him was silence and order. The white walls, the soft light from the window, and the light aroma of herbs created a feeling of coziness that he had not felt for a long time. The mother entered the room and immediately noticed that her son was no longer sleeping. She told him that the guards had found him in the forest and brought him home. In her hands was a plate with a sliced apple, a simple but thoughtful sign of her attention and love. Ratsu immediately understood what had happened after he lost consciousness and decided to find out how the girl he had saved was doing. He barely had time to start asking the question before his mother immediately understood what he wanted to ask. After his mother's words, Ratsu immediately felt better and exhaled deeply. A few moments of silence passed. The apples on the plate remained untouched. Then his mother spoke. She reminded him that her son had been training for the past 3 years. She sat down next to him on the bed and turned away for a moment to hide her emotions. With a heavy voice, she admitted that all this time she had dreamed of seeing him out of danger, wanted him to stop fighting monsters and live in peace. Her words were filled with concern and fear for her son, but there was also bitterness in them, because she understood how difficult it was for him to give up the path he had chosen for himself. She said that her parents were never strong warriors and lived like ragamuffins in their youth until they decided to devote themselves to farming. Despite this, she admitted with relief that she did not choose such a path for her son. The girl Ratsu saved thanked him with tears of happiness in her eyes, unable to contain her emotions. Her voice trembled, but every word was filled with sincere gratitude. Watching this, his mother smiled quietly and, sitting closer to her son, admitted that she saw how he was becoming stronger. Touched to the depths of his soul by his mother's words, Ratsu felt tears treacherously gathering in his eyes. His mother waited for a moment of silence and asked excitedly if Ratsu was going to take the exam to become an adventurer. There was worry in her voice, as if she already knew the answer, but still hoped for something else. Ratsu nodded and, without looking her in the eye, admitted that he really wanted to, but he couldn't forget about her and knew that she needed help. She came closer and sat next to him, hugging her son tightly, holding him close to her as if he were a child. Her hands were shaking, but there was warmth, fear, and pride in that embrace. Everything inside her was clenched, but she asked him to promise one thing, the one thing that mattered most in the world. She sat next to him, hugging him tightly, as if she wanted to protect him from all the evil in this world. Her voice trembled when she finally decided to say what she had kept in her heart for so long. She asked him not to die before his own mother. And she also asked him to protect ordinary people, those who cannot stand up for themselves. In the end, Ratsu couldn't hold back his tears. He was deeply moved and happy that he had such a mother. In her care, in every word she said, he felt a warmth that he couldn't find anywhere else. Patting him on the shoulder, she began asking him to visit her at least once every 6 months. She asked him to save money, eat well, and not go to bed with a full stomach. He couldn't hold back a smile when he heard this endless list of caring instructions. With a slight laugh, Ratsu thought to himself, can all this really be called one promise? 3 whole years had passed since his sister Ruby had left the village in search of power and new horizons. Much had changed in that time. And now, finally, the moment had arrived when his own adventure would begin. With his scabbard on his back and his mother's blessing in his heart, he walked out of the village. The wind blew on his face, and the road ahead was full of danger, mystery, and opportunity. His destination was White Rondo, a bustling city where every corner was alive with the energy and dreams of aspiring adventurers. It was where those who wanted to prove their strength, forge a name, and write themselves into the annals of the world flocked. Ratsu went there with the firm intention of passing the entrance exam and receiving the official title of adventurer. But unfortunately, his sword had become rusty again. The metal had become dull, and the magical glow had disappeared, as if it had never been there. Ratsu stared at his weapon for a long time, not understanding why the artifact had lost its power again. The brothers who had once abandoned it in the forest gave Ratsu a simple but sturdy sheath, made with their own hands. It was their way of apologizing, albeit an awkward one. Ratsu stood in the middle of a familiar clearing. The sky was covered with light clouds, and the silence seemed almost solemn. He slowly pulled his artifact out of its sheath. The metal was dull, covered with rust, and nothing gave away the power that had once awakened in the most desperate moment. His goal was to understand what kind of ability Kald had awakened in him then, in the fight with the demon. His heart beat steadily, his mind clear. He gripped the hilt of the artifact tightly, and began to remember that feeling, that inner flash of determination when the sword had transformed. Then fear and despair retreated before rage and the desire to protect. He tried to summon the same emotion, the same tension. If he had managed to awaken the power once, then he could do it again. The rust began to crumble away, like an old shell that was no longer needed. The metal underneath was clean and strong, emitting a faint glow. The sword transformed in his hands, once again taking on the same form that had once saved him and that little girl. Ratsu could hardly contain his excitement. He was incredibly happy that he was able to do this. Even in such an unconventional way, he managed to awaken a skill that seemed unattainable. His eyes glowed as he looked at the sword. It looked exactly like an artifact of a defeated demon. Each edge of the blade sparkled with a dark light, as if the weapon itself was breathing power and preparing for a new battle. Holding the demon's sword, Ratsu felt the power and darkness contained in its metal. He noticed the similarities to his own artifact, the shape, the runes, the dull ringing. The guard who helped Ratsu after the battle brought both swords, not knowing which one belonged to the boy. It turned out to be for the best. One of the side effects of the battle was that Ratsu began to see the characteristics of the artifacts. He carefully examined the second sword, a huge blade, shrouded in the remnants of black flames. It was a demon artifact. Its name appeared before his eyes, the Great Sword of Black Flames. Ratsu couldn't just leave the demon's artifact at home. He couldn't forget how he was almost destroyed by this weapon, and at the same time, it was the one that remained after the demon disappeared. However, Ratsu knew perfectly well that this was not his artifact. He knew that he would not be able to fight with someone else's artifact. Suddenly, both artifacts in his hands began to vibrate and slowly rise into the air. A faint glow emanated from them, and a thin, ringing sound was heard in the air. Ratsu froze, watching what was happening with wide eyes and an open mouth. He did not understand what exactly was happening, but he felt that this was an important moment. Not knowing what it was, he watched as the light gradually faded and the two artifacts merged into one. With a dull clang, a new sword fell to the ground. It was a cursed magical artifact, powerful and unfamiliar. Ratsu picked it up, looking at the weapon with surprise and a little trepidation. Ratsu stood dumbfounded, unable to believe his eyes. His artifact was emitting powerful energy, transforming into something else. A new skill appeared right in front of him, magic and the synthesis of sacred weapons. Ratsu was shocked. He tried to comprehend what kind of ability was now contained within his artifact. A new skill, artifact synthesis, which allowed him to combine related items using the blessing of an evil god as a strengthening material. Furthermore, he could use the magic of the resulting synthesized weapon, but with one limitation: it was only available if he had related treasures that had yet to be found. Ratsu thought that synthesis was a truly incredible skill. The image of the battle with the demon, when it used black flame magic, appeared in his mind again. Now this power was part of his own artifact. The thought of being able to control such magic filled him with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Despite the impressive status of the new artifact, Ratsu couldn't shake the feeling that this all looked like some kind of cheat. The magic was too strong, the effect was too powerful, as if someone was invisibly playing along with him. He looked at the sword with distrust, still not believing that it really belonged to him now. Meanwhile, an enemy was sneaking up on him from behind. They were Treants, and there were far more of them than he had expected. Ratsu turned and saw the giant shapes emerging one by one. Their gnarled bodies, covered in moss and leaves, moved with a dull creaking sound, as if living trees were rising from the ground itself. The monsters were slowly but inexorably approaching, surrounding him from all sides. They squealed loudly and shrilly, so that the sound seemed to cut the air. This squeal was unbearably disgusting. When one of the Treants suddenly lunged forward and brought down its massive paw, Ratsu reacted instantly. He pushed off the ground and quickly leaped back, dodging the blow at the last moment. The powerful blow flew past his face, mere centimeters, and slammed into the ground, sending chunks of soil flying. Ratsu pulled out his new artifact, and the blade of the sword immediately flashed with a dim light. Ratsu pulled the artifact forward and concentrated, summoning a new magic skill. Black flame erupted from the blade, thick and pulsating as if alive. It roared forward, engulfing the front line of Treants. The air vibrated with heat, and the sky darkened, as if responding to the power he had just awakened. Around Ratsu, the very space was ablaze. Black flames engulfed the clearing, erupting from the earth and sky, swirling in fiery vortices. Trees cracked and collapsed, the air trembled with unbearable heat, and shadows danced on the molten earth. With each heartbeat, the flames flared up more and more, as if responding to his will. He stood at the very center of the raging elements. In the end, all that was left of the closest opponents was a pile of ashes, scattered by the hot wind. The rest, seeing the unimaginable power, howled in horror. A long, wild cry swept over the clearing. Ratsu was relieved to see that his magic was actually working. He could feel the power flowing through him, responding to his will. The joy of this discovery filled his chest, but suddenly, as if by instinct, his body tensed. A sudden sharp pain pierced Ratsu's head, as if thousands of needles were piercing his mind at once. He instinctively grabbed his head, clutching his temples with both hands. The pain was so intense that it took his breath away. He couldn't even scream. His whole body convulsed, his knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. His ears were ringing, and his vision was blurry, as if reality itself was beginning to distort. On all fours, shaking in pain, Ratsu noticed his artifact through his blurred vision. Fear was growing inside him. Was this a curse? Meanwhile, the Treant, noticing that something was wrong with Ratsu, immediately took advantage of the situation. The monster's massive body began to move, and it rushed to attack. Broken branches and roots rushed forward, shaking the ground. While Ratsu remained defenseless, struck down by pain and unable to rise, the enemy was already within striking distance. Seeing the treant rushing at him with fury, Ratsu knew he wouldn't have time to dodge. His body wouldn't obey, his hands were shaking, his head was pounding with pain. He clenched his teeth, preparing to take the blow. Suddenly there were rapid footsteps. Someone was rushing towards him. Through the ringing in his ears, Ratsu heard a voice, loud, confident, clearly commanding. A warning was shouted at him to stay put. At the same moment, a figure flashed between him and the treant, ready to meet the blow in his place. The mud flew up, showering everything around him with heavy drops. Ratsu closed his eyes from the sudden splash and tried to open them, but the dust and pain made it difficult to concentrate. When his vision finally cleared a little, he noticed that the situation had changed dramatically. There was no longer a threat in front of him. A man with a huge shield stood right between him and the monster, planting it in the ground and blocking Ratsu's attack. The shield hummed from the impact, but its owner did not flinch. It was a girl. Her voice was firm and clear, but there was genuine concern in it. The first thing she asked was if he was okay. He looked at her, trying to focus, but he couldn't figure out who she was. Her face seemed unfamiliar. Ratsu didn't know who was standing in front of him, but he felt that he was not alone now. A city of aspiring adventurers, White Rondo was bustling, lively, and full of energy. Its narrow streets intersected with wide roads where carts and horsemen scurried. The city was surrounded by majestic mountains, their peaks rising above the rooftops, like a reminder of the trials to come. White Rondo breathed life and anticipation of adventure, exactly what Ratsu expected from a city. As he approached the Adventurers Guild building, Ratsu was stunned by its size. The huge stone structure towered over the surrounding buildings like a fortress. Tall columns supported the massive roof. Approaching the huge door, Ratsu pulled it towards himself with effort. The door slowly, with a drawn-out creak, opened, letting him inside. Upon entering, Ratsu immediately noticed the huge crowd of people filling the main hall. All of them, apparently, were participants in the adventurer's exam. He stopped at the entrance, amazed by their number. The noise of voices, the gleam of weapons, the sparkle of armor and colorful artifacts, all of this merged into one continuous feeling of a large-scale event. He had heard that the chance of passing the exam was less than 1%, and if he failed, the next attempt would be in 6 months. This thought weighed heavily on his shoulders. However, despite everything, Ratsu was sure that he could handle it. He could not afford to fail. He had promised Ruby that he would catch up with her. This oath burned in his chest brighter than any flame and did not allow him to doubt for a moment. He was determined to become an adventurer, just like Ruby. The girl, who suddenly stood between Ratsu and the monster, gripped the handle of her shield tightly and took the treant's furious blow without hesitation. Without turning around, she loudly and firmly ordered Ratsu to retreat and leave the fight to her. There was a confidence in her voice that left no room for doubt. Ratsu immediately began to analyze the situation. In front of him stood an adventurer, and one who had come specifically to protect him. This in itself was surprising, but what amazed him even more was the other artifact the girl was using. The shield emitted a powerful aura, and was not just a defensive item. It felt like it had a high-level power, and this was the first time Ratsu had seen such an artifact in action. Realizing that the headache had subsided, Ratsu felt his strength returning. He took a deep breath, feeling his body fill with energy. However, looking at his artifact, he noticed that it had turned back into a rusty sword. It was in this form that the artifact was truly itself, but it held something more. He quickly raised his sword and, not listening to the girl, who was sure that he could do nothing with the rusty blade, rushed into the attack. His eyes were burning with determination. His movements became sharp and precise. With one lightning-fast movement, Ratsu crushed the last enemy. At that very moment, his sword glowed with an ominous light and once again took on the appearance of a demonic artifact. The black blade swept through the enemy with terrifying force, leaving a trail of ash in its wake. The shield-wielding girl standing to the side watched in amazement, unable to believe that the rusty blade, seemingly useless, had suddenly turned into a magical weapon of destruction. She awkwardly asked if everything was okay, her voice a little shaky. Ratsu nodded and, breathing heavily, thanked her for her help. His words sounded sincere despite his fatigue and pain. They quickly switched to a calm conversation. Ratsu, having caught his breath a little, told about his artifact, explaining that it was unusual and required a lot of strength, which is why he quickly ran out of breath in battle. The girl listened attentively, without interrupting. After a short pause, they introduced themselves to each other. Ratsu's savior turned out to be Daya Karatsu. Stammering and avoiding his gaze, Daya said that it was time for her to leave. She awkwardly adjusted the strap on her shoulder and casually asked what Ratsu was going to do next. He shrugged, smiled, and said he wanted to rest for a while. They smiled at each other and said goodbye. Ratsu, looking at the back of the departing girl, thought about how someone had been helping him all his life. He firmly decided that the past was behind him. From this day on, he would protect those who were once important to him. Now he would act for those people who were not indifferent to him. In the main hall of the guild building, many people with mysterious artifacts had gathered, and Ratsu could tell this with just one glance. Pushing through the crowd, a small girl moved forward quickly and purposefully. Those whom she slightly brushed against along the way looked at her in surprise, not understanding what such a fragile and young girl was doing in such a place. When she reached the stage, the girl stopped and introduced herself loudly. Her name was Janet Chamu, and she was the examiner. Despite her childish appearance, she confidently declared that she had passed the blessing ceremony and was officially considered an adult. Everyone was amazed by her words. The girl was very short, with an impeccable appearance. She was wearing a lush dress, emphasizing her status, and her hair was neatly styled in two voluminous tails, creating the image of a doll-like, but self-confident person. Some of the participants looked at each other in disbelief, and indignant cries could be heard from the crowd. However, Janet did not pay attention to them. Keeping her cool, she began her explanation. The exam today would be held in a dangerous area, in the Nanashiki forest. Raising the doll above her head, she showed it to everyone present. This doll would be the key to the task. The main goal is to find the same one. Everyone was stunned to learn that the task was to find a doll. It seemed too easy for an exam, and immediately the hall began to cheer. Many were visibly inspired, thinking that it would not be difficult to cope with such a task. Janet added, as if in passing, that the Nanashiki forest was home to many kobolds, known for their passion for human things. She calmly noted that, in her opinion, they were most likely the ones who stole all the dolls. This information radically changed the perception of the exam. Joy instantly turned to anxiety. Those who had just been smiling with relief turned pale and felt a cold sweat run down their backs. Ratsu was well aware that the adventurers' test would not be a walk in the park. They would be heading into a dangerous area, inhabited by many ferocious monsters. He clearly understood that the test would not only test their ability to navigate the terrain, but also their ability to fight. The examiner also said that there were many other dangerous creatures in the Nanashiki forest besides the kobolds. Any threat to life and health was entirely the responsibility of the participants themselves. No one was responsible for the consequences. She emphasized that the number of dolls in the forest was strictly limited. Hearing this, Ratsu immediately understood the essence of what was happening. This was not just a test, but a real competition where everyone is for themselves. Only the fastest, most agile and decisive will be able to move on. She also reminded that killing people remains a serious crime. However, she did not rule out the possibility that the participants could meet with renegades. Their appearance is quite likely, especially in the conditions of the lack of control and supervision in the forest. Apostates were those who used artifacts for evil, violating established laws and moral principles. Ratsu was stunned by this news. He could not imagine that during the exam he would have to face not only monsters, but also people who deliberately chose the path of destruction. The examiner concluded her presentation by saying that the participants were allowed to team up and work together. Not only was cooperation not prohibited, but it was encouraged. She explained that if they managed to pass the test and earn the title of adventurer, they would be able to officially form teams. However, she immediately warned that this approach had its own difficulties. Each member of the group had to find their own doll, otherwise the result would be considered invalid. Ratsu wondered if he would be able to find partners. He knew that acting alone would be extremely difficult, especially in a dangerous area full of monsters and possibly renegades. There was little time, only 2 hours. His heart began to beat faster with anticipation and anxiety. At that moment, Janet clapped her hands. The hum of voices died down, and a tense silence hung in the hall. With a slight smile on her face, she announced the beginning of the exam. One of the participants, looking around, suddenly exclaimed that he had noticed the owner of a powerful artifact and suggested that they join forces. Ratsu thought for a moment that they were talking about him. His heart began to beat faster, but then he realized his mistake. The guy was addressing another, a tall young man standing behind Ratsu. They exchanged confident glances, shook hands and, smiling, declared that together they would definitely cope with the test. Ratsu watched this with slight awkwardness, feeling how loneliness washed over him like a wave. Standing aside, Ratsu felt lonely. He looked around at the other participants with doubt, wondering if anyone would want to team up with the one holding the rusty sword. Even if he activated his artifact, his appearance would be frightening, too similar to that of a demon. These thoughts drove anxiety and uncertainty into his heart. But suddenly, a loud cry rang out from behind him. Someone had entered into an argument, and this abruptly pulled Ratsu out of his thoughts. It was Daya. She stood in front of a group of 3 girls and insistently asked to be accepted into their team. They looked at her with distrust, not rushing to answer. An empty space formed around them. The other participants retreated, forming a living ring. Everyone silently watched what was happening, as if they sensed that something important was about to be decided. Ratsu immediately recognized his recent acquaintance and raised his eyebrows in surprise. He had not expected to see her here, much less among the participants in the exam. The thought that she had also decided to go through this ordeal confused him a little. In the center stood a tall girl with a cold expression. On either side of her were twin sisters, their arms crossed over their chests in the same way. The leader of the group was yelling at Daya, waving her hand angrily and pointing straight at her. Her voice was ringing with irritation. She did not hold back and said sharply that she did not have to take someone like her into the team. According to her, Daya was weak and unreliable. The girl was yelling at her to finally realize how useless she seemed to be for passing a serious test. As he listened to the accusations and ridicule being leveled at Daya, Ratsu felt a familiar, almost forgotten feeling welling up inside him. He remembered how the boys in his home village had mocked him mercilessly when he was younger. They had laughed in the same way, pointed their fingers, and told him he was no good for anything. He remembered the day when the hero of Polluti himself, without even really looking him in the eye, had told him bluntly that he had no chance of becoming an adventurer. These memories rang painfully in his chest, like wounds that had never truly healed. The girl didn't stop, and with each word her voice grew louder. She looked at Daya with disdain and declared that a true adventurer must fight demons, and not hide behind others. She smirked and said loudly that with the shield artifact, Daya would not be able to defeat any opponent. What good is a shield against a monster's claws or a demon's flame? Who would even go into a party with someone who can't attack? She ended her tirade with a question that sounded disdainful. Could someone like her even dream of becoming an adventurer? Ratsu stood to the side and watched the events with tension. Anger boiled up in him with every phrase thrown in Daya's direction. He clenched his fists so hard that his knuckles turned white. The girl from the group did not calm down. She took a step forward, as if on purpose, so that everyone around could hear her words better. She said with a grin that this test was not a walk, but a real test of strength. Here you need to destroy monsters, fight, risk your life. And she looked at Daya, as if through her, and asked loudly and mockingly if she really thought that with such a useless artifact she would be able to find at least one doll. In conclusion, the girl raised her chin and said coldly and confidently that if no one wanted to even talk to Daya, then there was no point in imposing themselves on them just because they were from the same village. Her voice sounded harsh, almost like a sentence. Daya tried to answer, but her voice betrayed her. She stumbled, looking at the ground, and could not utter anything intelligible. The other girl became even more angry when she saw that Daya was standing there, not intending to leave. With her face twisted in anger, she raised her hand to strike, shouting that she had made it clear that Daya had to back off. But before her hand could reach its target, someone firmly and abruptly stopped her movement. It was Ratsu. He appeared suddenly, as if from nowhere, and grabbed the girl's hand tightly. Daya, cowering in anticipation of the blow, slowly opened her eyes. Seeing Ratsu standing in front of her and the alien hand no longer threatening her, she could hardly believe what was happening. Her eyes were filled with surprise and relief. Ratsu, not letting go of her hand, said coldly that she had gone too far. His voice was calm, but there was an inner rage in it. The girl, frowning, tried to break away. She looked closely at Ratsu, realizing that she was seeing him for the first time. He was a stranger to her, neither from the village nor from her acquaintances. Daya recognized Ratsu and let out a sigh of relief. Her face showed genuine surprise and relief. The girl who had been yelling at her earlier frowned, not understanding who this guy was and why he had interfered. She looked him over from head to toe, as if trying to determine how dangerous he was. Her irritation grew when she realized that Ratsu knew Daya. Without responding to the mocking glances and words of the girl in the group, Ratsu turned his back to her, as if she did not exist. His attention was completely focused on Daya. He calmly and confidently stepped towards her, looking her straight in the eyes. Then, without hesitation, he offered to take the exam together. His voice sounded confident, without a hint of doubt. The girl in the group froze in amazement, not believing her eyes. She hadn't expected anyone to seriously side with Daya. The other participants, who had been just watching, were now looking at each other, not hiding their surprise. There was tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting for what would happen next. Despite the tense atmosphere and the looks from all sides, Ratsu continued to speak with a slight smile, as if what was happening was something ordinary. He confidently stated that he considered himself and Daya to be an ideal team, and that he was sincerely glad to meet her again. His calmness and goodwill at such a moment caused even more shock to those around him. Those who had just watched the conflict could not hold back their ironic grins. For them, everything that was happening looked ridiculous. A lonely girl with a useless, in their opinion, shield, whom no one wanted to help, suddenly found herself in a team with a guy whose artifact even looked like a pile of rusty metal. This combination seemed funny and absurd to the viewers. Some whispered, others giggled openly, discussing how long this strange couple would last. As examiner Janet Chama watched the proceedings, she shared her thoughts with her assistants. She noted that this year there were especially many participants with a burning desire in their eyes. Among them were those who showed great promise. But what caught her attention most were the children, who were not afraid to step out of the box and take risks. Janet said that it was precisely these children, those who were not afraid of difficulties and acted contrary to expectations, that they were ready to support. Half an hour had already passed since the exam began. All the participants had managed to reach the Nanashiki forest, which greeted them with a heavy atmosphere and strange silence. The trees stretched to the sky, forming a dense dome through which light barely penetrated. Ratsu and Daya walked along a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. The Nanashiki forest seemed unexpectedly calm. Soft light filtered through the leaves, refracting on the dewdrops and reflecting all the colors of the rainbow. It seemed as if nature itself had carved this forest out of precious stone. It shone with 7 colors and shimmered, as if it hid a magical secret. Ratsu couldn't help but think that if monsters didn't live here, this forest would have long ago become a place for travelers and nature lovers. Ratsu suggested that it would be great if they could avoid fighting monsters. However, common sense told him that it would hardly be that easy. He understood that trials and dangers lay ahead. Time was running out, and the main task was to find the kobolds as soon as possible and return the stolen dolls. Hearing no response from his partner, Ratsu turned around and wondered if she might not want to work with him. Suddenly, Daya began to stutter, and he stopped to listen carefully to her words. Daya asked Ratsu what he meant when he said they were compatible. She was embarrassed, and at first Ratsu did not immediately understand that she had misunderstood his words. As Ratsu began to explain what he meant, a monster suddenly appeared behind him. Daya noticed the monster first and shouted loudly to warn Ratsu. Ratsu stood there dumbfounded, not understanding what was happening as the demon rushed towards him. There was no time for explanations at this moment. He had to act quickly and decisively. Daya instantly jumped forward and stood up to defend herself, raising her shield artifact, which shone with a bright light, reflecting the enemy's attack. Ratsu quickly came to his senses and, assessing the situation, pulled out his artifact from behind his back, preparing to deliver a decisive counterattack. Determination flashed in his eyes, and he focused on his opponent, ready to protect Daya and overcome the danger. With one powerful blow, he instantly defeated the enemy. Turning to Daya, Ratsu calmly explained that while she stood guard, he would take on the fight with the monsters. This was their perfect compatibility. Ratsu explained that the cursed sword gave him severe headaches when used for long periods of time. He could only fight with it for half an hour before his mind would start to go haywire. So he needed reliable protection, and if Daya was there to cover them, he could focus on fighting without fear of losing control. Daya was touched that Ratsu believed in her strength and believed that she could protect them both. Daya confessed to Ratsu that she used to be a crybaby and was often the object of ridicule. It was because of her weakness that others did not want to take her into the team. This burden of the past had weighed on her for a long time, but now she was ready to prove the opposite. Ratsu turned completely towards Daya and said with confidence in his voice that although her artifact was not meant to kill monsters, her true strength was in her kindness and willingness to help even strangers. These words sounded sincere and deep, making Daya feel different. For the first time, someone saw in her not weakness, but the true strength that lies behind her tenderness and care for others. Ratsu confidently said that Daya was stronger than she thought, and these words caused her genuine surprise. She did not expect to hear such a thing, and felt how something inside her changed. For the first time, someone saw in her a strength that was not measured by weapons or loud victories. Suddenly, magical spells were fired towards them. It was obvious that the source of the attack was a human, not a demon. Daya reacted instantly and managed to put up a shield in front of her, shielding both herself and Ratsu from the flying magic. The next moment, a powerful spell hit the barrier. There was a dull roar, and the impact sent clouds of dust flying into the air. Visibility deteriorated sharply, but thanks to the shield's protection, they both remained unharmed. Daya recognized this magic immediately. However, now it was aimed directly at them, and used with a clear intent to harm. Confusion was reflected in her eyes. It was Amesti, her former friend and the same girl who had previously refused to accept her into her group. Daya couldn't believe her eyes. Their eyes met, and there was no doubt on Amesti's face. On the contrary, there was determination in her eyes. The one with whom she had once shared dreams and training now directed a magical attack at her without hesitation. Daya's chest tightened. Amesti looked at her with disdain and said with cold fury that Daya had never been able to do anything except hide behind others' backs. There was malice in her voice, as if she had been waiting for this moment from the very beginning. She said that today was the day she would finally crush her, as befits a worthless person. These words were full of venom and contempt. Ratsu stepped forward and, not hiding his indignation, loudly asked the girls what exactly they were trying to achieve. His voice was sharp, like a blow. He looked straight at Amesti, demanding an answer. The tension in the air increased, as if even the trees were frozen in anticipation. Amesti reminded them with cold arrogance that the exam rules allowed them to fight apostates for the sake of dolls. There was a malicious glee in her voice, as if she was already enjoying her own rightness. Ratsu immediately objected, reminding them that he and Daya didn't have a single doll yet, so attacking them was pointless. However, Amesti only smirked, as if she had been waiting for this objection, and mockingly pointed her finger behind them. Behind them, a kobold burst from the bushes with a furious roar. Its eyes were blazing with malice, and its curved claws glinted in the sunlight. It rushed toward them, arms flailing, as if already anticipating easy prey. Ratsu barely had time to turn, instinctively raising the artifact. The creature approached with alarming speed, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it carried something more than just animal rage. Daya reacted instantly. She stepped forward, raising her shield with practiced confidence, and the next moment the goblin crashed into its surface with a loud thud. The air shook with the force of the impact, but the shield held. Sparks and dust flew from the impact site, a dull sound echoing through the forest. Ratsu was not prepared for such a quick encounter with the kobold. Kobold slammed his claws into Daya's shield with a maddened fury, each blow accompanied by a nasty, shrill laugh. He was strong, but not particularly intelligent. He seemed to relish the attack itself, not caring about strategy. Daya's shield shook from the force of the blows, but she held it tightly, not allowing the monster to break through. Focused and tense, she glanced at Ratsu and said that there was only one enemy. Ratsu quickly glanced at his opponent and noticed an important detail. On the side of the kobold, attached to his belt, hung a doll, the same one required to pass the exam. At that moment, Amesti's voice came from behind them. She declared with caustic certainty that Ratsu and Daya were going to steal the doll that their group had been hunting for from the very beginning. Almost simultaneously, the twins standing on either side of her spoke up. Their voices merged into unison, sounding accusatory. They called Ratsu and Daya thieves. So there was no choice. They really had to fight. As soon as Amesti gave the signal, the twins, Spinel and Lazu, rushed to the attack. Their movements were honed and coordinated, like those who had trained together for many years. They acted as one, attacking from both sides. Ratsu realized in a split second that this whole situation was not accidental. The kobold had appeared with the right doll too cleverly, and Amesti and her partners had come for him too quickly. Everything that was happening looked like a carefully thought-out plan. One of the twins raised her hand, and flames burst forth from her palm, rushing forward in a fiery stream. At the same time, the other one clenched her fist, and the air around her trembled with cold. Shards of ice flew out from her hand, sparkling in the sun like blades. Fire and ice magic fell upon Ratsu and Daya at the same time. All three of them, Ratsu, Daya, and even the kobold, froze in surprise. The attack that fell upon them was so swift and powerful that it caused them to freeze for a moment. However, this time, Daya did not fail. She reacted instantly, thrusting her artifact forward and standing between the attack and her comrades. The shield glowed, reflecting the magical blows. Flames roared as they struck the defense. Ice shards shattered against her barrier, flying in all directions. The girls were shocked that their attack did not reach its final target. Even the kobold, who appeared behind her, stared at her in surprise, not believing that the fragile-looking girl could stop such a force. However, the kobold quickly realized who his real enemies were. He squealed angrily, bared his fangs, and lunged forward, aiming straight at Ratsu. At the last moment, he jumped aside, barely dodging the claws. Without wasting a second, Ratsu snatched up his artifact and seized the initiative in a lightning-fast move. Meanwhile, Amesti, standing at a safe distance, had already finished casting her spell. A stream of magical energy began to swirl around her, and the air began to crackle with tension. Amesti's attack was so devastating that its power went out of control. A huge magical projectile crashed into the ground with a deafening roar. In an instant, the forest was illuminated by a bright flash, and a powerful blast wave rolled across the area. The ground shook, the air was filled with soot and dust. The force of the blow was so great that even Spinel and Lazu, who were too close, were unable to dodge. They were thrown to the sides. Despite the force of Amesti's attack, Daya held firm behind her shield. As the smoke gradually cleared, it became clear that she was not giving up and was still standing. In response, Amesti began to mock sarcastically, stating that they would not win by simply standing on the defensive. Ratsu looked at Daya with concern. His eyes betrayed his worry, and he asked if she was hurt. The girl smiled slightly, straightened up, and confidently said that she was completely fine. Amesti looked at them with disdain, not understanding how Daya, whose power was never used to attack, could say that everything was under control. In her eyes, it was ridiculous. She smirked and crossed her arms over her chest, sarcastically remarking that it seemed like the two of them really were perfect for each other. One with a rusty sword, the other with a shield that could only hold off blows. Amesti's voice rang with mockery, as if she were watching a ridiculous scene. She snorted sarcastically, looking them up and down with a haughty smirk. Were these two seriously planning to become adventurers? It was simply ridiculous. Disdainfully, she shouted at them not to embarrass themselves and make her laugh with their pathetic attempts to look like heroes. Suddenly, the kobold, taking advantage of the chaos of the battle, rushed towards Amesti from behind. He moved lightning fast, barely audible, and came so close that only at the last second did she notice his presence. Turning sharply towards the sound, the girl did not hide her shock. Her eyes widened in surprise, while the kobold's claws were already in the air. Her group, Two twin girls reacted instantly and rushed to help. They were sure that the kobold, being alone, would be afraid of their strength and would simply give up the doll, retreating. However, the monster did not even think of obeying. Meanwhile, Ratsu activated a new ability of his artifact. In his hands, instead of the old rusty sword, a demonic blade appeared, covered in dark patterns and emitting a faint ominous glow. Ratsu gripped the hilt of his blade tightly and stepped forward, his movements confident and swift. His eyes blazed with determination, each step bringing him closer to the center of the fight. Amesti noticed his approach immediately and let out an irritated cry, warning the twins that another enemy was approaching. The twins turned at the same time, their faces contorted in surprise, but they instantly prepared for battle. Ratsu raised his sword above his head, his arms tensing. The tip of the demonic blade flashed in the rays of light and rushed towards the enemy with inexorable speed. The blade cut through the air with a deafening sound and pierced the body of the kobold. The enemy did not even have time to scream. The sword passed through him with such force that the monster fell to the ground already cut in half. Everything froze for a split second. Amesti and the twins froze in place. Their weapons were still raised, but their hands were shaking. Their eyes reflected fear and amazement. None of them expected Ratsu to be able to deal with the kobold with one blow. He, who seemed like a clumsy guy with a rusty sword, suddenly revealed a power they could not even imagine. The silence after the blow was oppressive, the air seemed thickened. Ratsu stood over the body of the falling kobold. Silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional rustling of the leaves. Neither Amesti nor her friends dared to move. Behind Ratsu lay the doll that everyone had been hunting for so diligently. Amesti stood there, unable to believe what was happening. Her voice shook with disbelief as she asked abruptly how Ratsu had managed to defeat the kobold. After all, such monsters usually wielded artifacts of a much higher rank than the one he had. Ratsu was breathing heavily, his forehead was covered in cold sweat, and his temples were throbbing with pain. His head was splitting from the strain, using the demonic blade longer than it should have taken its toll. He staggered, but managed to stay on his feet. Rising to his feet, Ratsu straightened up and looked at Amesti. Despite the pain, his voice was confident. He said that he was participating in the exam on the same basis as she was. He was a candidate like everyone else here. And next to him was his partner, Daya. And she was also undergoing the test, regardless of what others thought of her. Amesti was furious at his words. Her hands were shaking, her fingers clenched tightly into fists, her nails almost digging into her palms. He spoke calmly, looking forward, as if his words were not a reproach, but a simple conclusion. If their group had a shield like Daya's, he would have been able to stop his blow. If they had such protection, they would not have been hurt. Amesti froze in place. Her face was filled with shock. Ratsu continued speaking calmly but firmly. He stood up straight and confident despite the headache throbbing in his temples. In his opinion, if Daya were on their team, they could have repelled any attack. She would have covered them, just like she had covered him. He didn't understand why they would reject such a reliable ally. Amesti screamed at him to be quiet, to shut up. Not because he was wrong, but because the truth was tearing her apart. She looked Rat straight in the eye and, clenching her fists, said that he was being selfish. He had no right to judge. He didn't know how she really felt. Ratsu stood confidently, not looking away, his face calm and determined. Across from him, Amesti was breathing heavily, her shoulders shaking, her hands clenched into fists. She was barely containing her rage, as if she could explode at any moment. Noticing that the twins' artifacts were damaged, Ratsu calmly said that they could be repaired at the church and offered to take the girls there. He started to explain something, trying to justify the situation. Although it was just an exam, Ratsu was genuinely upset that he had caused the destruction of the twins' artifacts. But Amesti abruptly interrupted him, sending him far away, not letting him say a word. While Ratsu and Daya just stood there, watching them walk away behind them, not saying a word. There was a silence in the air, filled with innuendo and a slight sense of confusion. Suddenly, Daya plucked up her courage and called out sharply to her old friend Amesti. Amesti stopped instantly, but did not turn around, as if trying to ignore her voice and pretending not to hear the call. Ratsu quickly walked over to the doll lying on the ground, picked it up, and immediately turned to his partner, who still hadn't taken his eyes off the departing group. After a moment of deep thought, Ratsu soon decided to break the silence. He turned to his partner with enthusiasm and confidently spoke about how this was a great start. Now they had one doll, which meant that Daya could finally become a real adventurer. Suddenly, Ratsu noticed that Daya was crying. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, and tears were quietly running down her cheeks. She was still looking in the direction where the Amesti group had disappeared, unable to contain her emotions. What had happened just a few minutes ago had hurt her more deeply than she wanted to show. She didn't understand. Couldn't everything be like before? What happened to her friend Amesti? She spoke quietly, without looking up. She told him that she and Amesti had been childhood friends, growing up in the same village, sharing dreams and joys. It was Amesti who had taught her to be strong, who had supported her when Daya couldn't cope and cried all the time. Amesti was always there. She helped Daya in everything, both in her studies and in her training. She was like an older sister to her, not by blood, but in spirit. They were inseparable, and Daya believed that it would always be like this. Meanwhile, Amesti's group slowly moved through the forest. The twins, walking behind, talked indignantly among themselves. They did not hide their displeasure. How could such a stupid guy like Ratsu dare to break their artifacts? After all, they were going to become the best in this exam, to prove their strength and skill to everyone. Now their plans collapsed, and anger boiled inside with every step. Amesti walked forward, clenching her fists and seething with anger. Everything inside her was seething. She was sure that now it was her turn to show herself, to prove her strength. She found a way to move faster than anyone else, learned to not give in to a fight, and always take a hit. Even studying, which was once difficult for her, has now become her strong point. She has developed methods to remember and understand any material. All this for the sake of one day becoming the best, and now, when the moment has finally arrived, everything has fallen apart. She worked harder than anyone, didn't allow herself to rest, and tried to become not just stronger, but the best in everything. At the same time, she sincerely tried to establish relationships with everyone, strove to be part of the team, to gain respect and friendship. It seemed to her that this is how it should be. After all, it seemed to her that as she became better, stronger, smarter, more needed, then there would definitely be those who would want to stay. Then she would no longer be alone. And so, on the day of the ceremony, Amesti received an artifact, the Birang Sherdin bracelet. It was the best artifact among all, and the other students unanimously recognized her as the best. Everyone was happy for her, and Daya sincerely congratulated her friend, admiring how far she had managed to advance. Amesti thanked Daya with a smile and patted her head, wishing her luck. Daya thanked her with slight embarrassment and headed to the altar to receive her own artifact. Meanwhile, Amesti continued to congratulate and say warm words. Even the twins, beaming with envious admiration, did not miss the opportunity to express their respect. Suddenly, a murmur swept through the hall. People began to whisper, exchange glances of amazement. Someone had just received the Shield of Immortality, an A-rank artifact. Amnesty turned around sharply, frowning. This was impossible. Her heart began to beat faster. She couldn't believe her ears. At the altar, illuminated by a soft light, Daya was indeed standing, clutching a massive shield tightly in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide open in surprise. She was visibly shaking and stammering, trying to say something. Despite the fact that the artifact was outstanding and clearly stronger than the others, the fear in her eyes was stronger than the joy. It seemed as if she herself did not believe in what was happening, and did not understand why she was the one who received such power. Daya, her voice shaking, turned to Amnesty, barely holding back her tears. She asked for her forgiveness. At that moment, something clicked in Amnesty's head. It was as if the whole world froze for a moment, and she realized that her efforts were not enough. Despite everything she had been through, despite the sleepless nights, the hard training, and the desire to be first, she was not the best. Amnesty stood there dumbfounded, unable to comprehend what Daya was apologizing for. Why was she apologizing for having the best artifact? Why wasn't she, Amnesty, in that place? Her mind was racing. Where had she gone wrong? When had it all gone wrong? She thought back to every day, every training session, every sleepless night spent with one thought, to be the best. And now it all seemed in vain. All her persistence, all her effort, seemed to have simply disappeared. She didn't understand why she should feel sorry for someone who had destroyed everything she had ever strived for in one fell swoop. Daya had taken away her dream, her victory, her recognition, everything she had lived and fought for. A burning sense of injustice was building up in her chest. Why should she feel sorry for someone who had taken all of that away from her, even if it was unknowingly? Amnesty was brought out of her thoughts by the loud voice of one of the twins. They asked with resentment in their voices what they should do now, since their artifacts were destroyed and they could no longer participate in battles. As if brought back to reality, Amnesty clenched her fists. Amnesty confidently declared that she would fix everything quickly, and that they would definitely pass this exam. She promised that the three of them would become the greatest adventurers this world had ever seen. There was determination in her voice, and inside, gratitude that despite everything, the twins were still by her side. They began to discuss the mysterious swordsman, because he aroused genuine curiosity. Who was he, and where did he come from? His artifact seemed especially strange, old, rusty, as if useless. But suddenly, right before their eyes, it changed, as if awakening from a long sleep.